It's my pleasure today to welcome all of you to this rather unusual gathering in which Berkeley undergraduates, mostly undergraduates, are actually going to present their research along with a smattering of graduate students just for some intellectual diversity. Some of you know, at least those of you who are associated with Berkeley do know, that Berkeley is one of the only public university in the US that is part of the Global Six, which is the 6 leading research universities in the world. They've also discovered something called CRISPR-associated proteins 9, which will help you edit your genes, either make you better people or make completely new people, as some would like to do, or, for example, new carbon sequestration methods to help us get cleaner energy. But all those discoveries are actually preceded by a far more fundamental kind of research that actually poses questions. And at the end of the research, we actually don't know what the answer is. All of a sudden, we have a finding we cannot explain. That, to me, is the most terrifying and the most exhilarating moment as a researcher, because you don't know where you're going to go. And what you will find today is that Berkeley undergraduates, over the last semester, using the latest data science techniques, such as causal inference, GIS mapping, and experiments, have actually launched on a journey of this kind of discovery. You will hear, as they present their research today using data, you'll find that they will provide insights into Indian politics and Indian society that will surprise you. Sometimes they won't have an answer, but they're raising questions that all of us need to think and take seriously. But you're not here to hear me speak. You're here to listen to them. But before I proceed, I want to acknowledge a couple of people, and I just want to give you a brief lay of the land as to how we're going to proceed. First, I'd like to thank Mr. Jairam Ramesh for coming out here, and he needs no introduction. And thank you for coming and offering to be the moderator. He's going to lead the discussion as soon as the students have finished their presentation. I would also like to thank Tarun Kapoor and Charu Kapoor for actually helping us organize this. So thank you so much. And the plan for the day is pretty straightforward. Each of the students will speak for about 5 minutes. No questions, only boos and applauses are allowed. After they are done, the floor will be open. Dr. Ramesh will go first, and after that, the floor will be open for questions from the audience. And after the event is over, feel free to mingle and do whatever you like to do. We are here for you. So with that, we know the system. The students know the drill.
Thank you, Professor Chiba. So I'm Akshay Balwani, and my research looks at how national election outcomes affect state elections. Conventional discourse in India states that when a party wins Lok Sabha elections, they have a honeymoon period, or that they carry a wave into assembly elections that follow right after, which means that a party that does well in the Lok Sabha election is bound to do well in the Vidhan Sabha elections. My question challenges that and asks, do general election outcomes actually influence electoral outcomes, or are there other factors at play? To do this, I look at aggregate data at both the national level and at the state level from the Election Commission of India, covering 20 states across India over the period of 34 years from 1977 to 2007. The entire data set consists of about 38,000 observations. Of that, I look at about 4,000 in which a parliamentary election precedes a Vidhan Sabha election. Here are the states that have been considered. States formed after 2001 have not been considered for lack of data. What we see is that in about 30% of election cycles, parliamentary elections and Vidhan Sabha elections happen in the same year. We also see that 80% of the time, Vidhan Sabha elections happen right after Lok Sabha elections. The assumption that is important to this research is that the time difference between two elections will play an important role as to how much of a honeymoon period a party can carry into the next election. Here are some election cycles that have been considered. The methodology for this research is the regression discontinuity design. And while that sounds complex, what it really is that it looks at constituencies in which a party won or lost a seat by a small margin of loss or victory, and then looks at the causal effect of that on its fortunes in the assembly elections that happen after that. For example, consider the 1998 parliamentary elections and the outcomes in constituencies where the margin of loss or victory for the Congress or the BJP was small. And then look at the causal effect of that on the 1998 assembly elections in Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Delhi, and Mizoram. So what this small band of loss of victory gives us is that it isolates the effect of only winning or losing, and therefore we can draw a causal inference. For this research, we look at the two largest parties, the Indian National Congress and the Bharatiya Janata Party. Let's look at our findings for the Indian National Congress. Here what you see on the x-axis is the vote share of margin of loss or victory. So on the right-hand side of 0 are all those constituencies in which the Congress won by a small margin. Small is then given a slack and extended up to 15%. On the left-hand side, you see all those constituencies in which the Congress lost by a small margin. If there was an impact of winning or losing, which means that if winning had an impact on the outcomes of the number of MLAs that you can win in the Vidhan Sabha elections that happened right after, what we should be seeing here is something like this, a upward sloping curve. Notice on the y-axis here is a change in the number of MLAs, which means if in one election cycle you had X number of MLAs, in the next election cycle, is there a change in the number of MLAs? And does the vote share of margin of loss or victory have an impact on that? The fact that we see practically a flat line tells us that statistically there is no relationship, that the outcomes in a Lok Sabha election have no effect on the outcomes in Vidhan Sabha elections. But you may question and say, seats are not the same as vote share. So what we do is look at vote share. What we see is that even when we see vote share margin of loss or victory, whether it is positive, that is on the right, or negative, that is on the left, has no effect on the actual vote share the Indian National Congress got in the Vidhan Sabha constituencies within that parliamentary constituency. But of course, this is the Indian National Congress, the largest party contesting in the most number of seats. So we look at the next largest party, the Bharatiya Janata Party. The Bharatiya Janata Party, while you do see a little bit of a fluctuation, statistically, what we see is that there is no impact. The fact that you see this fluctuation is because the Bharatiya Janata Party really came into existence in 1984. And so there are way fewer data points for them, which gives us this fluctuation. But actually, statistically, the vote share margin of loss or victory in the Lok Sabha election has no impact on the change in the number of MLAs or the vote share of the Bharatiya Janata Party in the Vidhan Sabha constituencies within that Lok Sabha constituency. What can we infer from this? We conclude that Indian voters are not affected by the outcomes of Lok Sabha elections when they go to vote in Vidhan Sabha elections. Voters are more considerate about other factors, maybe leadership, maybe anti-incumbency, maybe organization structure of the party. There are other factors in play, not the fact that a party won or lost a Lok Sabha election. With this data and with our findings, what we are able to say is that conventional discourse in the media and generally that there is a honeymoon period and that a party winning or losing in a particular election has an impact on its outcomes in the Vidhan Sabha elections after that is not true. But this is really preliminary research. This can be taken to the next level. And what I do is I see a few avenues where this can be taken. One is, what is the impact of a party forming government? So does the fact that the BJP formed government in 2014 have an impact on it? Another way to look at it would be, what is the impact of anti-incumbency? And luckily for you, we'll have more research on that today in our last presentation by Harsha, which is looking at anti-incumbency. That's really all I have. And I'm open to any questions later on during the moderation period or during after the event, and we can discuss this in greater detail. Thank you. I'll call on Michael Dittmer to give the next presentation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Dittmer, and I'm going to be taking a look at how welfare policies affect people's political party preferences. More specifically, I want to take a look at how the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act has affected people's trust in the Congress Party that implemented it about 10 years ago. Why policies? Policies establish a track record. They're real-world evidence for people to evaluate and continue to reevaluate their trust in a specific party. Why Manrega? Manrega is a federally implemented, well-known policy that has been in effect for about 10 years now. We can see its effects on the ground. On top of that, it's a hot-button issue. It's a hot battleground between the Congress Party and the BJP, which makes it a very relevant area to assess trust in the Congress Party. In terms of framing the question, my independent variable was whether or not someone had benefited from Manrega. I also take a look at what someone's opinion on the implementation of Manrega was in their area. I'll get more into that until later. The question from the Lookneedy Tracker poll in 2013 asks, have you or your household members benefited from Manrega in any way? The dependent variable, the way in which I measure the effect of Manrega, was through an economic party preference. There was a question that asked, for handling economic crises, which party do you think is better? All right, so I'm going to go briefly into a summary of my findings and then go into more specifics later, deeper into the presentation. Now, we might expect that if you benefited from Manrega, you were more likely to trust the Congress Party that put it into place. However, the far more important finding here is that your opinion on the implementation of Manrega, the merits of the policy as good or bad, were actually more important and were enough to outweigh the benefit that you received. I'll get more into that later. In terms of demographics, we might ask whether different types of groups will respond to Manrega in different ways and thus have their trust shaped in different outcomes. And what I find is that Manrega has a very similar impact among different genders and different castes. However, it does not have an effect amongst religious groups, and I'll get, again, more into that later. Finally, other issues. A hot issue has been the charisma of Narendra Modi, the so-called Modi effect. And does Manrega impact people's trust in the Congress Party given the charisma of Modi? I actually find that the answer is yes, and that the Modi effect isn't as overwhelming as people sometimes make it out to be. Okay, so let's dive into the specifics. How it matters. The poll asks a question: are you satisfied or dissatisfied with the way that Manrega is being implemented in your area? So this question very specifically asks what your opinion is on the implementation in the place that you live. Now, breaking down here, this bar plot here, this takes a look at percentages of people. And so on that question, there are two groups: people who thought that the policy was poorly implemented, and then also people who thought that it was well implemented. As you can see here, green is INC, or the Congress Party, and orange is the BJP. And the box below here indicates which party is more trusted. So for example, here the orange bar is higher, which means that the BJP is more trusted. And then we have the question here: did you benefit from Manrega? 2 is yes, and 1 is no. And so the interesting part that we can see here is that across people who thought that Manrega was poorly implemented, it didn't matter whether or not they actually benefited from the policy. Either way, they were more likely to trust the BJP because they thought it was a poor policy. Breaking this question down, I wanted to compare two groups, both of which had received a personal benefit from Manrega, but had a difference of opinion on the implementation. And here, as you can see, the differences are even more stark. As you can see here, in the poorly implemented group, BJP trust is higher. It's only in the group in which there was a benefit from Manrega and also an opinion that the policy was well implemented that we actually see more trust for the Congress Party. And in fact, it accounted for almost a full 5 percentage points difference in trust for the Congress Party. All right, next, let's take a look at demographics. Are different demographics shaped in different ways on whether or not they received a benefit from the Manrega policy? And what I actually find across men and women, across scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, OBCs, and other types of castes, is that whether or not you received the benefit was the biggest factor here. If you received a benefit, trust for Congress was higher. If you didn't receive a benefit, trust in the BJP was higher. And as you can see, this similar effect is observed across men and women, and the same was observed across different castes as well. Now, the important part is that the effect is economic only. In other words, if you benefited from Manrega, if you thought it was a good policy, you were more likely to trust the Congress Party in terms of their economic competence, and you weren't simply applying it to other areas. I looked at a control question. For countering terrorism, which party do you think is better? The logic being that terrorism is a security policy related question that doesn't have anything to do with welfare policy or economic policy. And as you can see, trust in the BJP is higher across the board, whether or not you benefited from Manrega. This is good for the outcome of this project because what it indicates is that people aren't simply blindly applying trust to the party simply because they received a windfall benefit from a policy, that they're actually being strategic about how they apply their benefit and their opinion of the policy. Does Modi matter? The answer is yes, but not as much as you might think. So what I did is I divided into two groups, people who like Manmohan Singh and people who like Narendra Modi. And it was based on a point scale. So for example, if you liked Manmohan Singh and you did not like Narendra Modi, you received a positive point score. And alternatively, people who liked Narendra Modi and did not like Manmohan Singh received a negative point score. And what I actually found is that for the group that liked Modi, if you benefited from Manrega, you were actually a little bit more likely to trust the Congress Party. What this is indicating then is that Modi is not such a heavy factor or a heavy-hitting influence that it would wash out or outweigh the effect of a Manrega policy on your trust in the Congress Party. Limitations. Religion is still a really divisive issue, and as we might expect, Muslims will trust the Congress Party due to the Hindu nationalist stance of the BJP. And in fact, as we can see, whether or not you benefited from Manrega, you were still far more likely to trust the Congress Party. To recap, Manrega's merits as a policy, how well it is implemented, how well you think that this policy, how good or bad this policy actually is more important than the windfall benefit that you might receive personally. However, that is not to say that the benefit is irrelevant. And in fact, the benefit has an effect across different types of groups such as gender and caste. The implementation outweighs the benefit. It is economic preferences that are specifically being informed and not other areas that are not necessarily related. Finally, religion is still a divisive issue. However, contrary to some popular belief, the Modi effect is not as much. I look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you for your time.
I'm Tanu Kumar, and I'm here to talk to you about an ongoing field experiment that I'm currently working on with two UC Berkeley professors, Allison Post and Isha Ray. As many of you know, water in most towns and Indian cities is intermittent, which means it doesn't arrive 24/7, and it stops and it starts. In many places, the water also does not conform to a supply schedule, and particularly in low-income neighborhoods, the water also does not follow an observable pattern. Households in these low-income areas are also doubly affected by this unpredictability of water because they may not have storage units to store this water, and so they are often waiting for water, which leads to wasted time, undue stress, and missed obligations. So we can't really do very much about the intermittency of water at this point, but can we do something about its unpredictability? NextDrop is a social enterprise started by UC Berkeley engineering students, and it's based in Karnataka. And what NextDrop does is they send customers text message notifications that will let them know when their water will return or whether or not supply has been canceled. And the way they do this is that they work with valvemen, the people who are actually turning water on and off. And these valvemen are sending in text messages to NextDrop to tell them, yes, I've turned the water off, or no, turn the water on, or no, I will not turn it on today. And NextDrop will disseminate these messages to its customers. And they're currently rolling out in Bangalore, and last year they completed a pilot in Hubli Dharwad. Our project is trying to figure out, does NextDrop actually help people? And who does it help exactly? And the way we're doing this is we're using a field experiment. So this map shows a utility subdivision of BWSSB, which is the water provider in Bangalore. And each of these individual polygons is a cluster, and there are about 100 of them that we've placed in the utility subdivision. And what we're doing right now is we're interviewing 30 households from every cluster, so 3,000 households across the board, and we're just asking them basic questions about their water usage habits. And what we're going to do next is we're going to randomly pick 50 of these clusters, so half of the sample, and deliver next drop service to them. And to the other 50 households, we're not going to touch them. And in 6 months, we're going to go back and we're going to survey all of these households again, and we're going to ask them again about their water usage habits and see how they've changed over this time. So, like I mentioned, this is an ongoing project, and we haven't yet rolled out the service to all of these households. But we can observe some patterns already. So, first of all, 70% of respondents say that their water arrival is unpredictable. They cannot name a specific window of time in the next couple of days when they can confidently say that their water will arrive. 56% of respondents also report feeling worried about water arrival times. And this is 56% of all respondents across all income groups. But we believe that if we break our sample up only into low-income respondents, then a much larger percentage of respondents will report feeling worried. Also, another one of the questions in the survey was, respondents were given the statement, BWSSB takes the water problems of people like me seriously. And they were able to agree, disagree, or say they didn't know. And people for whom water is unpredictable are less likely to agree with the statement and more likely to disagree with the statement. So respondents for whom water is unpredictable tend to have much less favorable views of the utility company. So what do we think Next Drop will actually do? We believe that we'll see household effects and political effects. The household effects are straightforward. Reduce wait times, reduce stress, and less spending on alternatives to piped water, such as bottled water or water tankers that you call for delivery. We also expect to see better perceptions of the state utility and a greater willingness to actually pay for water services. And like I mentioned before, we really expect these effects to be strongest for low-income households. So, this year, like every year, the central government of India and state governments are spending a huge amount of money on infrastructure and service delivery projects. And I'm sure you'd all agree with me that it's really important to know are these projects helping? Who are they helping? And experiments are a really good way to answer these questions because we can figure out exactly what changes we can attribute to the project and which ones would be the result of something else. And by having a treatment and control group, we can compare the effect of delivering a service to the effect of not delivering the service at all. And so hopefully our experiments will allow us to create more effective interventions. So like I mentioned, we're not really going to have the full results of the study for about 6 months, but I'd love to take any questions or suggestions you might have in the future.
I'm Susan Osterman. I'm going to be talking today about some research that I've been doing with a colleague who is at UCSB, Amit Ahuja. Anyhow, Tanu just told you about one of the positive benefits of using experiments in social science research, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about another one. Over the years, social scientists have discovered that certain questions are not readily answerable with traditional methodological tools. I'm going to talk today about how we're now using experiments to try to develop a deeper and more accurate understanding of political and social attitudes and behaviors of contemporary Indians. But what types of questions are problematical? In general, those questions that require a respondent to describe a belief or behavior that that person might want to hide can be particularly tricky to get accurate answers to. Think for a moment how you would answer if I asked you directly, are you willing to marry somebody of another caste? Or are you willing to let your son or daughter marry somebody of another caste? Or how about if I asked you, do you preference politicians who have lighter skin color? Now, I think if I'm talking to you directly, the answer to the first is probably going to be yes, and the answer to the second is probably going to be no. But reality is a little bit more complicated than that. Experimental methods allow respondents to reveal their preferences, allowing us to get more accurate results closer to the truth. So let's take a look at how experiments work and the types of results they often yield. My colleague Amit Ahuja and I, we were interested in finding out, determining whether endogamy is practiced. Endogamy is the practice of marrying within one's own caste, and trying to figure out whether Endogamy is practiced as widely as it is thought to be practiced in urban middle-class marriage contexts. To do so, we ran an experiment via 3 of India's largest matrimonial websites, Shadi.com, Jeevansati.com, and BharatMatrimony.com. We used 9 real grooms, and we used 3 in each of 3 states, Maharashtra, Uttar Pradesh, and Tamil Nadu. They were all quite similar. On paper, they looked identical. They had similar family backgrounds, similar educational backgrounds, skin tone, height, the whole thing. All of them very good catches. Now, the only thing we varied was the caste of each of these grooms. Okay, so in each state, there was an upper caste groom, an OBC groom, and an SC groom. And we had each of these grooms contact the same set of women, sending letters of interest to the same set of women. Now, each of them was also fully willing to marry somebody of any caste. So caste was no bar to their marriage decision. When we had them contact all of these prospective brides, 1,500 of them in all, we looked at the positive response rates for each of the grooms. Okay, so we tried to figure out who was responding to whom more positively. Positive responses indicate that somebody is willing to take a relationship to the next step, not necessarily marriage, but it indicates, it reveals a willingness, a preference for intercaste marriage, and that's what we're going to look at next. So what did we find? And this is the part where I use the fancy pointer. We found that these 2 predicted probability estimates here, and this is a model. So we put a lot of data into it, and we tried to figure out how people behave. Those 2 predicted probability estimates are higher, and note that these are the SC categories over here. Non-SC is to the left. So the fact that both of those dots to the right are higher than the dots to the left indicates that SC brides are actually far more willing to consider intercaste marriage than their upper caste counterparts. But we also think that there's an exchange mechanism at work in which upper middle income, and that's what this UMI stands for, upper middle income SC brides are even more willing to consider intercaste marriage. And what we think they're trying to do is they're leveraging the fact that they're leveraging their socioeconomic status and trying to sort of exchange it for caste status. On the other side, we see the inverse being true. Here we've got, it's the lower middle class brides, upper caste brides, who are far more interested in intercaste marriage. And we think that in this case, these brides are actually trying to use their caste status and leverage it to gain socioeconomic status. Moving on, skin color. So same co-author, Amit and I were also interested in finding out whether Indian voters prefer fairer political candidates to darker complexioned political candidates, as a theory called colorism, which has been tested all over the world but not in India, would predict. What we did to do so, we sampled the electoral rolls here in Delhi. We took 720 voters off of the electoral rolls randomly. And we assigned one of these 3 gentlemen, it's actually the same gentleman, to each respondent. Okay, and what we said that we were doing a survey in which we were that was funded by somebody who was thinking about running for political office in their district. Okay, so not somebody who was running. We weren't deceiving them in terms of, this person was going to be on the ballot in the next few days, but somebody who was thinking about prospectively running. We then asked them, we then showed them one of these photos and told them next to nothing else about this particular candidate. We didn't tell them party, affiliation, caste, profession, last name, anything, okay? And we then asked them whether they would vote for the candidate. Now, I didn't think very many people would respond, having given them very little information, but actually 673 of 720 responded to this question. We then analyzed the data by comparing the treatment groups, okay? So people who saw fair to people who saw dark, et cetera. Broadly, we find quite a bit of support for colorism theory. And if you look at the top here, that highlighted section, this is all voters. And that is the percentage of the people who responded favorably to that question. They would vote for the fair candidate with no other information. But what's far more interesting than that is the other highlighted sections, which you get down here. Now, Dalits and the poor are defying colorism, okay? They are actually treating darker complexioned and fair complexioned candidates quite equally. Now, these are statistically not differentiable, these two highlighted areas, this one, and also up for the Dalits. They are not treating, they're not very interested in voting for the Swedish candidate. And I have some ideas about why that might be, and I can talk about that a bit later. But what do these results mean broadly? Our marriage results suggest that while endogamy is the dominant practice still in modern Indian middle-class marriage markets, that social attitudes are in fact changing and liberalizing. And this has profound political implications in a country in which individuals are thought to vote their caste, not cast their vote, okay? If people are not wedded to marrying, pun intended, to marrying within their caste, they may not on election day actually vote with their caste any longer. Our skin color results suggest that a darker complexion candidate, dark complexion is not actually as much of a hindrance to political success in India as colorism, a very robust theory, would predict. And this may actually explain why so many of India's elected representatives, relatively speaking, have darker skin. What we found, and we actually coded all of the Delhi MLAs elected in 2013, which is when we did this survey experiment, and 25% of those MLAs were actually dark complexioned according to the same metric we used in the rest of the experiment. Oh, that's too early. I've foreshadowed it. But what I wanted to say was, perhaps more importantly than these two findings themselves, what do these two examples mean for the future of social science research in India? And I think what they mean is that we can actually leverage these new methodological tools to gain leverage on some very tricky and difficult to answer questions. So that leaves me with my last slide, which you've already seen, and asking all of you quite earnestly, I would love to hear your contributions and what you would suggest. What should we be focusing on next? What sort of things would you like to see? So I look forward to talking later, and I will turn the floor over.
Research is on urban migration and caste politics here in India. I kind of start with a common notion that basically caste matters a little bit less in urban areas of India compared to rural areas of India. But my research breaks this down a little bit further. I look at the difference between those who have lived in the urban space their entire lives and those who are newcomers to the urban space, who weren't born there. And what I find in my research, what it points towards is that actually this urban attitude, this willingness to kind of shed away caste a little bit more, is actually an import from outside largely rather than kind of something born within. All right, so up here on the board, I kind of wrote the standard narrative that I already went over, that caste is less salient in urban areas. So when asked the question, do you think somebody should vote with their caste, what we find is 30% of urban Indians say yes, while 40% of rural Indians say yes. A similar question says, while voting, what is the most important consideration for you? And what we see is rural Indians 50% more likely to say caste is the most important thing when voting. And this is represented by the blue bars down here. And this is a very large sample size. But when we look at really recent data work done in Delhi, what we see is that 21% those surveyed are actually from Delhi, which really begs the question, what does urban politics even mean? How can we really explain this narrative between the difference between urban and rural Indians when so many people are coming and going? So what my research did is I made two discrete categories of all respondents in urban India, and I called them urban natives and urban migrants for the purpose of my research. And they're defined down here, but basically, urban natives are those who currently live in an urban space and have lived there their entire lives. Whereas migrants to the urban space, they live in an urban space right now, but they come from elsewhere. And once we break our data into such, what we see is that actually 35% of urban natives agree with that one should vote with their caste compared to 31% of urban migrants. So basically, the urban natives, those that have lived in the urban space their entire lives, kind of lived and breathed it the longest, they actually look a little bit more like rural respondents than do the urban migrants. So this really shakes up our standard narrative that there's this rural-urban divide and really begs us to look at it further. I wanted to make sure it wasn't just one caste group really driving this relationship. So I controlled by caste. And what I did is I took the 3 largest caste groups in the sample, and they happen to represent a vertical spectrum. We see Brahmins up here, Rajputs, and Jatavs. And what I really want you to focus on in this graph is the difference between the blues, the difference between the greens, and the difference between the oranges. Because what we see here is that migrants in every case are the most likely to say, no, one shouldn't vote with their caste. I was also curious about caste reservations and the difference between migrants and natives in this regard. And what we see is that migrants to the urban space are more likely to disagree with caste-based reservations, basically. So we see this general delinking of caste and politics among migrants to the urban space compared to natives to the urban space. Trying to understand how this difference was happening, what was going on, I didn't want to just look at political attitudes, but social attitudes as well. So kind of using the latest and greatest survey experimental methods that tried to accurately gauge prejudice, which, as Susan Osterman spoke to, is a little bit hard to get unless you have really the right survey methods going on. When we ask, would you be willing to invite a family from a lower caste into your house for a social gathering, what we see is that migrants are more likely to hang out with these people of lower castes than are natives to the urban space. So there's this connection, that social attitudes and political attitudes, and this delinking from caste. Still, how can we explain these differences? Ultimately, more research needs to be done, but I think a large driving factor in this is associational participation. What do I mean by associational participation? I mean participation in caste-based organizations, religious-based organizations, even sports organizations and the like, something where you're brought together with like-minded or otherwise similar individuals to yourselves. And what we think is that those who are more embedded in the local context, more participatory in these associational groups, they're likely more to work more indirectly in accessing state resources, whereas those who are newcomers to the urban space, less embedded in the local context, are going to want to work more directly with the state, have a more independent relationship, not be working indirectly through these groups, and thus prefer a more neutral state, one that doesn't give communal advantages to one group or another. So like I said, more research needs to be done, but preliminary evidence does point to the idea that we would all probably predict that natives to the urban space are more embedded in the local context. They are more willing to, participate in caste-based organizations and the such. So the point I really want to drive today, while also saying that more research needs to be done, of course, at Berkeley, is that this urban-rural divide that we see and we hear about all the time is really a bit more complicated than it at first appears on the surface level. And ultimately, this urban attitude, this willingness in the urban space to shed caste, is largely an import from the outside. So I'd love to talk to you guys more about this after the program. So if you have any questions then, I would love to take them. But thank you so much.
So my research is about civil society and religious violence in India. And I would argue that the master narrative of Indian politics would actually be the Hindu-Muslim divide. Started during the birth of India in 1947, after independence, we have seen the split of India and Pakistan along religious lines. And even more recently, in 2002, the state of Gujarat has seen the deaths of nearly 1,000 people due to the riots between the Hindu and Muslim communities. Therefore, I'm really interested in religious violence and more specifically, how can we reduce it? And existing political science research has actually pointed to the fact that civil society is one of the most important mechanisms to reduce religious violence. And my question tries to answer, why is this the case? Why is religious violence reduced when people participate in civil society? In answering this question, I have come up with two hypotheses. And the first one, for the purposes of my research, I've called it the state trusting hypothesis, in that civil society increases people's trust in the state. Professor Varshney of Brown University has argued that inter-ethnic organizations in India force people to work with the state to police tense situations, which in turn creates a synergy between civil society and the state to prevent sparks from becoming fire. The second hypothesis that can explain how civil society reduces religious violence would be the positive stereotype hypothesis, in that civil society can actually foster trust among people of different religions by making them work together, and this form of personal everyday intermingling could actually reduce negative stereotypes of other religious groups. My research, however, finds really strong evidence for the former, but weak evidence for the latter. So to conduct these statistical analysis to test the hypothesis, I have based my data from the State of the Nation Survey 2009, which has over 14,000 respondents, but I've only focused on over 11,000 of the Hindu respondents, namely for two reasons. In that I'm interested in the Hindus' perception of other religious groups, and also there are not enough Muslim respondents to accurately and representatively capture their opinion. And I've classified these respondents into the four following categories that you can see on the graph based on their type of associational participation. And at y-axis, you can see the percentages of the respondents who belong to each category. So the first category is what I call the non-group, as in these are people who do not take part in any associations at all. The second group would be people who only take part in religious associations only. The third group is a more important one, is what I call civil society. And these are the people who take part only in non-religious civic organizations. And of course, the last group would be people who take part in both religious and non-religious associations. And based on existing literature, we would expect that people in the civil society group would exhibit greatest level of trust in the state as well as in other religious groups, and therefore they might have the most positive stereotype of other religious groups. So now let's test the first hypothesis, whether civil society really does increase people's trust in the state. And in order to measure the level of trust in the state, particularly the police, I have chosen 6 specific questions from the survey to do my analysis. And the questions include questions like, would you go to the police, or would you refer people to the police in times of need? Do you think that the police would actually treat people of different genders, different religions, different castes, and different socioeconomic classes equally and fairly? And over here, the graph actually shows the percentages of people who answered yes to these questions. And if you answer yes to these questions, it would indicate a certain level of trust in the police. And as you can see, the trend is pretty consistent over the 6 questions, which is really good for the purposes of my research. Because as you can see, the purple graph in every single question is actually the highest. What that means is that people who take part in both religious and non-religious associations are more likely to answer yes. And what this really means in the bigger picture is that participating in both religious groups and civil society will create the maximum effect for trust in the state, which actually goes against existing literature that argues that religious groups do not really make much of a difference. And in my research, however, I found the opposite effect, that both religious and non-religious groups actually matter at the same time. Now let's take a deeper look at one of the questions that directly deals with religious issues. And the question goes, do you think the police will treat people of majority and minority religions equally and fairly? And these are the following results that I've found. What I've found is that the level of the percentages of people who answered I don't know to this question are significantly higher among the groups who do not take part in non-religious civic organizations. Whereas the percentages of people who answered yes is significantly higher for those people who took part in civil society. What this means, the way you can interpret this graph, is that taking part in civil society can actually convert don't knows into yeses. Again, in the bigger picture, what this really means, once again, is that civil society does make people more likely to trust the state. Taking part in civil society gives people information to establish an opinion, which tends to be more positive. People tend to have a greater impression of the state, and therefore they exhibit greater level of trust in the state if they take part in civil society. Now let's test a second hypothesis, whether civil society participation would dilute negative stereotypes of other religious groups. And in order to measure religious stereotypes, I've chosen this question. Is a particular religion associated with terrorism? And again, these are the following results. As it is in the previous table, the level of I don't knows are significantly higher among people who do not take part in civil society. However, among the latter two groups, people who take part in civil society are both more likely to answer yes and no. What this really means is that taking part in civil society can actually convert I don't know people who have no opinion to this question into people who have an opinion. In other words, civil society gives people more information to establish an opinion about other religious groups, and this opinion can become more positive or more negative. It actually polarizes opinions and sharpens the political divide over this particular issue. So from my research findings, I have come up with two specific conclusions. That there is a state trusting effect, that civil society does reduce religious violence, mainly by enhancing people's trust in the state. And the way that I would explain this phenomenon can actually be found in one of our colleagues' research. Unfortunately, Kriti is unable to join us here, but she has found that civil society participants are more likely to be better politically networked. And in turn, they will use these political connections to gain more access and collaboration with the state, thereby enhancing their trust in the state. The second conclusion would be a polarized stereotype effect, in that civil society does not necessarily only dilute people's negative stereotypes of other religious groups. In fact, participating in civil society would polarize opinion. However, identifying the conditions under which civil society would lead to a more positive or a more negative stereotypes would actually require more future research. So this is all I have about how civil society could actually reduce religious violence. And of course, there will be greater avenues for research in the future. And I would love to talk to all of you after our event. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for being here. My name is Vasundhara Sirnath, and today I'm going to talk to you about a different type of violence. We've heard from Yoon Roo today about religious violence in India, and she's done some exemplary work on it and how to reduce it. The type of violence that I try to understand is mostly insurgent violence that you see in different parts of the country, mostly in Northeast India, in Jammu and Kashmir, and in Central India in the states of Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh most prominently. Along with this, I'm not just going to talk about insurgency per se, but also the type of violence that is born and carried out by the state against people that it considers its own citizens that we call counter-insurgent violence. So let me take you through this. The US Army's counterinsurgency manual, we call it COIN because we think it's a little bit shorter and cool, it says that an insurgency is an organized movement that is aimed at the overthrow of a constituted government through the use of subversion and armed conflict. Now, I don't need to tell you that there's a lot of that in India. What you need to understand, however, is the fact that in 1947, not only did India become an independent country, it also became a state that had to learn counterinsurgency really, really quickly. And it did that by trying to mimic models of counterinsurgent wars that were fought primarily by the British. As far back as 1955 is when the first types of wars started between the Nagas and the Indian state, much later by the Mizos. And since then, I have counted between 1947 and now about 206 insurgent groups that have operated in India since that time, out of which about 56 are still active. Now think about this, and think about how the state's biggest security threats actually do not come externally, but in many cases come internally from different groups that exist within the country. Before I proceed any further, I'm going to entertain you a little. I'm going to show you some pictures. Here we go. So what I did for this project, well, that's not very entertaining, is it? Sorry. When we do this type of work, we develop a really morbid sense of humor. I've been doing this for about 7 years. Okay. So what I did was that with a research assistant called Jackson Reed, who is from Stanford University, we collected basically what we call a bloodbath data set. We were trying to log every single insurgent attack that we could find in the Asian recorder since 1955. We did that between 1955 and 2008. What we did was we recorded not only the attacks, but who was killed, how many people were killed, and specifically how many security force personnel were killed in every attack. And this is what you find. What you see is that sometime after 2001, there's a very sharp rise, not only in the number of attacks, but in the number of total people killed and security force personnel killed. We've hypothesized since that this is primarily because of Maoist activity in central India, and also because the manner in which insurgent groups have adapted to new technologies of killing has become pretty advanced. So now not only are they using assault rifles like AK-47s, which coincidentally they also steal from the armories of the local police and the military, but also they figured out how to make improvised explosive devices. And you see a lot of this in central India, and you see some of this in Jammu and Kashmir as well. Then what I did is, I wasn't really happy with these lines. So what I did was I actually GIS mapped my data using mapping technology, which Google very kindly makes available. So what I did was I've generated a satellite image, and what this tells you is the same data that you saw in the previous slide, but only you see a spatial spread, and then you see it's a heat map. So the warmer the colors get, the more intense those districts have, that is how intensely those districts have witnessed and had insurgent attacks over time. And the lighter the colors get, if they get light green, a little bit yellow, it's not that bad. Now, this is one. This is the second one. This tells you the total number of soldiers and police that have been killed in insurgent attacks in that time frame. And as you can see, Jammu and Kashmir actually has exacted quite a heavy toll. And at some place in southern Chhattisgarh, you're seeing a really big red dot, which should tell you that actually within a very short span of time, the Maoists have actually exacted a pretty heavy toll. And that primarily is because the Indian army is technically not fighting them. They're being fought by the CRPF and the border security forces. The CRPF has been doing this a little bit longer, typically don't have the type of training that the Indian military does. And finally, these are the total number of people. This excludes security force personnel that have been killed in insurgent attacks in the same time frame. Now, when I was looking at all of this data, there was something that kept coming to mind. I did 120 interviews with counterinsurgency personnel, people that were actually in the field making ground-level decisions about what they were going to do with certain types of insurgent groups. They were very kind in speaking to me on conditions of anonymity. What emerged is this question: why does the Indian state pursue different counterinsurgency strategies in different regions of India? What I found, and this really puzzled me because I actually don't think that there's a good answer to this out there. Why does the Indian state use heavy coercion in places like Punjab and Jammu and Kashmir? Why does it decide that it wants to enter into treaties and negotiations and ceasefires and suspensions of operations treaties with people in the Northeast? Primarily, this has already happened in the late 80s when Rajiv Gandhi was Prime Minister in Tripura, Mizoram, and Nagaland. And finally, why does the Indian state decide that it wants to subcontract force to private militia? Like in Chhattisgarh, where the Salwa Judum was specifically raised to fight the Maoists. And as I discovered last year on a month-long visit to Kashmir, which incidentally coincided with the flood there, that the Indian military has been doing the same thing there. They've raised a special group of people called the Ikhwani that were former militants, right? So there's this question, and here's how I try to answer it. I want you to consider this. Now, these are taken directly from the interviews that I've done, and these are just some of them, just a few. So I asked them, what do you think about the people that you're fighting? Who are they? And this is what they said. In Chhattisgarh, this is a BSF officer. He says, you know what, they eat grass, they have no medicine, they still go to Jar Poochwalas. How will they handle things on their own? And as I've written in the bracket, this signals that this BSF officer actually thought of these tribal people that were in the Maoist movement as extremely primitive people that were being misled. And in Mizoram, another officer who was with the army, he said, you know what? The Mizos are really well disciplined. They're like an army. There was this sort of grudging respect that I found in a lot of people that were in the army that had served in the Northeast, specifically when they talked about Mizos and Naga groups, right? Now, I started to think that there might be something here. So what I did was I went and sat at the National Defense College in New Delhi for over a month, and I read 52 dissertations that military people had written while they were doing courses there. And again, they were very nice. They let me have access. They didn't know why somebody wanted to read this stuff, but I did. And the next thing I did was I talked to more people, and I said, you know, why did you pact in Mizoram, and do you think it would work in Chhattisgarh? And in Chhattisgarh, the answers were very clear. No, it's out of the question. They need to be kept in line. And in Mizoram, they said, well, you know what? They're good warriors. They knew how to organize, and we can, talk to them, basically. That was the idea that was coming out, right? Now, here's what comes out of my project. How do I explain this variation? Why does the Indian state do all of these different things, depending on the adversary that it's facing? Now, the big thing that comes out from the interviews that I've just shown you is that how state actors see who they're fighting really matters. Well, you can call it perception, you can call it bias, you can call it stereotype. But the fact is that if I don't like someone and I'm a state actor and there's an insurgent adversary that I'm not too fond of, I'm going to do the worst type of counterinsurgency campaign against them. Because these decisions at the local level are taken by local actors, right? On the other hand, through prolonged rounds of fighting, it is entirely possible that I develop a positive perception of my adversary. At that point, I may actually recommend that there might be something else to reduce the level of violence that is being done by the state against groups. It also depends on where the adversary is located. If there's a sensitive border like Jammu and Kashmir, and where most of the groups are actually sometimes funded and trained by the inter-services intelligence, as we found, it is not possible technically to sort of be lenient. And Mr. Parikar actually had a statement to that effect in the papers just, I think, a couple of days ago, which was a little bit problematic for different reasons. But the second thing is if your adversary is located in the interior of the country, it is entirely possible to play hardball with them. And this is precisely what the Indian state is doing with the Maoists. The third thing is that the coherence and the organization of the adversary really matters. If there's a fragmented insurgent group, the state has no clear signal about who it's going to pact with. I need not tell you that going cross-national, this is kind of the problem that the United States is facing when it's dealing with Taliban splinter groups and Al-Qaeda splinter groups. There's basically no clear leader. You don't know who you're going to pact with. So splintered organization is typically very, very bad for a state. And well, there's more I want to say, but I want to be cautious of time. So if you have any questions, I'll take them a little bit later. Thank you.